Howdy, Jacob here. Today we're going to do a more in-depth analysis on Cardinal Health. We reviewed this company a little bit ago and it got to a price where it looks like a very solid deal today. And so I'm going to review the numbers and then I'm going to go over some of the results that I pulled from the 10Q, 10K quarterly reports. This will be more subjective on what I pulled, some of it, and then other parts of it will be on capital allocation and the way that the things that I look at when I look at a company's quarterly or annual report. And so just understand everything I say will be of my opinion. Don't take everything I say verbatim. Please do your own analysis, and this is meant to be reviewed in conjunction with your own analysis, so please keep that in mind. But let's review the company's financials before getting into some of the items I pulled from their quarterly and annual report. So revenue is over doubled from 10 years ago, but we are seeing a decline in gross margin and a decline in operating margin, where both margins are very small. A gross margin of 3.4% in the most current year and an operating margin of 0.9% in the current year. Their dividend per share of $1.99 looks like to be a substantial amount for the earnings per share, but you'll see in a little bit that their free cash flow is much greater. Return on invested capital recently has not been very grand. In the mid-20 teens, it did look to be over 10%, but since then they really haven't had a great return on the money reinvested back in the business. They have $4 billion cash on hand, less than that in long-term debt, a little bit short-term debt. So balance sheet does look pretty safe. And then, like I said, much greater production of free cash flow. Likely, or their 5-year average is a bit over $2 billion, whereas on the income side, it's all over the place. And it's really because in 2017, they kind of changed from an acquisition business, which you can see over here. They made a bunch of acquisitions, and then they haven't really made many acquisitions since then. And so they've basically just been writing off some of that goodwill. Maybe their acquisitions didn't work out as well as that they wanted to. And so they're able to write those off on the income statement, but cash flow is cash in, cash out. So it would not affect that. So let's go over some of the notes that I pulled from their quarterly reports in 10K, 10Q. So the CEO notes are pretty general, but I do appreciate the highlights and the guidance being more than 1 year. I did find guidance all the way to 2027. They said this is just their desired CAGR on revenue and on profit. So I did appreciate that. Their contract with OptumRx, which is their second largest consumer or their second largest customer, making up 16% of revenue in 2023, expired in June of 2024 and was not renewed. And so it's not their greatest customer, which is CVS, which has about 25% of their 2023 revenue. But to have their second biggest customer go out is a huge deal. And so you'll see in my revenue figure that I took that into consideration, and you need to take it in, or you should take it into consideration for your own analysis. In the last 9 months, pharmaceutical solutions make up 92% of revenue, up 11% year over year, with a profit margin of just 1%. Global medical products make up 6% of revenue, just up 1% year over year, with a profit margin of just over 0. And then their other makes up 2% of revenue and is up 12% year over year. Excuse me, with a profit margin of 9.4%. So their other is the least significant portion of their revenue, but it is the greatest portion of their, not the greatest portion, but the greatest percentage of their margins. $3.5 billion left under their current share repurchase program that expires at the end of 2027. Their market cap is currently $23 billion. So that is over 10% of shares left in the share repurchase program. So that's cool. 2% dividend yield. Table to the right shows future obligations and share repurchases. So I did think this was interesting. They put down all their future obligations, and obviously the most common one that we know of is long-term and short-term debt. So they have about $4.6 billion in their long-term and short-term debt, with majority due 2027 and thereafter. They have interest on debt. They're just going to see that if you have debt, you have interest on it. So really no surprise there. Lease obligations, again, same thing for your capital leases. You're gonna have to pay for that. And so purchase obligations, this one is interesting though. Their opioid litigation. So their opioid litigation still has 5.8 billion outstanding, with about half a billion this year, 837 over the next 2 years, 832 over the 2 years after that, and then 3.7 billion thereafter. So there is still a good amount of money left to pay states for their opioid litigation. And so that's going to be taken into consideration in our assumptions as well. And then in total, they have about $14 billion due over the next forever that they know of as of this moment. And this is at the end of 2023. I pulled that from the 23 10K. Capital allocation for the 3 years of 2021 to 2023 are minus 12% net acquisition because they did a divestiture, and then their very small net acquisition. So it was actually negative. 23% to their dividend, 45% to share repurchases, and 29% debt paydown. And over here, we can see their share repurchases over the last couple years, and we see that there was a significant buying 21 Q4, 22 Q4, and 23 Q4. It looks like Q4 is going to be the time where they repurchase the most. And I mean, they're fairly consistent about repurchasing annually. They don't repurchase a huge amount every single quarter, but annually they're pretty consistent in buying back a lot of shares, which can be beneficial for the shareholder if they're buying back at a cheap price. Because again, everything is every allocation that they use their cash for, is an opportunity cost of what else they could have done with it. So if they bought back shares that are only going to get 4% return over the next 10 years, but they could have given you a dividend, you could just invest it in an S&P or something, got 9, 8, 9, 10%, or reinvested it and possibly gotten 12%. So you have to think about opportunity costs, and companies have to think about opportunity costs when it comes to capital allocation. So here, I do think that 6% growth rate seems to make sense to me. However, I'm backing out the 16% loss of revenue from OptumRx. And so I think conservatively, I can say, compared to that 6%, take out OptumRx, 3.5% annually seems to make sense to me. Their margins have really been going down, and pretty substantially. So we can see that their gross margin is almost half and their operating margin is less than half. And so I think I want to push these margins down a little bit more because I want to be very conservative, especially with very low margin business. 3% share change, that was still reasonable. 3% for their current market price would be about 700 million. And in relation to their well over 2 billion free cash flow with not a lot of debt, that's very manageable, about 35% payout. I'm not concerned about that. Their dividend, I'm fine increasing that. It's even less. It's about 500 million, so they can definitely afford that. But we are leaving a little bit of money for acquisitions, maybe a little bit for debt pay down. And as for terminal PE, again, this is just because they have such a low margin business and declining margins. I want the opposite. I'd rather you grow less than 6%, increase those margins, than grow at a very promising 6% while decreasing the margins. I care about the bottom line way more than I care about the top line. I want gushing free cash flow because that's what's going to give me return as the business owner. So with these new assumptions, it needs to fall about in half. Pretty big changes, but again, there's a lot of changes sometimes when, it doesn't sound like a lot, but a margin of 1% versus 0.6%, that is a huge decline. And so you have to, although it's only 0.4% of a margin change, it is 40%. And so there were some big changes here that I made, but I do think that, it's a fine business, just one I would definitely want to get cheap given the fact that margins are declining, margins are as low as they are. And, who knows, it might fall a little bit given the fact that OptumRx is 16% revenue, and that could hinder their short-term abilities. So we'll see. But for me right now, I'll just be waiting and looking at other companies in the meantime. So I hope you enjoy the video. Thank you.